Levels of poverty in the Caribbean are still unacceptably high. Indeed, in many parts of the region, these levels are higher today than they were a decade ago. Something then is fundamentally wrong. What I'm going to argue here is the following. Genuine development in the Caribbean, I contend, requires a fundamental, the word that is used is deconstruction, a fundamental deconstruction of the very nature of development discourse. In particular, it requires a reconceptualization of the whole nature of Caribbean poverty. That's my basic argument. We need to go back to basics. And I have here, maybe you can just pass these around. I have here some copies of my paper, and there's a diagram in there, and that's the diagram that I'm going to use. As I've argued before, economic production in the Caribbean is predicated on productivism, on increasing economic production. This epistemology, this way of viewing development, is itself legitimized by many superstructures in the Caribbean, in particular national governments. The Prime Minister of Grenada, for example, had a wonderful speech last night. It was quite interesting, but it fits precisely into what I'm talking about. There's a productivist epistemology. He was arguing, for example, we should have regional integration within the Caribbean, but the sole objective, of course, is to increase economic production. Apart from national governments, of course, there are many other superstructures that legitimize this productivist way of viewing development in the Caribbean. The USAID, World Bank, the IMF, and of course, all the other international quote-unquote development institutions that work in the Caribbean legitimize this way of viewing economic development. And as you can see in the figure that I've handed out there, the application of this productivist way of viewing economic development leads to a complex set of impacts on the Caribbean's productive base. These impacts, and this is the point I'm trying to make here, these impacts are predominantly destructive and in turn engender and exacerbate Caribbean poverty. And then I go on to talk about, for example, the impacts on nature. What we have through economic production are destructive impacts on nature, which in turn lead to an overexploitation of nature, which in turn leads to poverty. The best example, of course, as I mentioned before, is in Haiti, but it's happening in several of the islands now. The problems of environmental pollution, of soil erosion, and so on. And it is all tied up with the mechanism of production. So that's the impacts on nature. I talk also about the impacts on indigenous knowledge systems. And this is something that Trevor is going to talk about in much more detail in a minute. Because of our productivist approach to economic development in the Caribbean, we are destroying what is perhaps the major mechanism that we have for solving poverty, and that is the knowledge of the people themselves. The best example, of course, that I can think of, because this is a very personal experience, is the destruction of folk medicine systems. I remember when I was a kid, growing up in Trinidad, my grandmom, we had this area of wood in the back of our house. And whenever we'd come down with a cold, for example, she'd go there and cut some herbs, concoct some horrible tasting thing. And in a couple of days, the flu disappears, right? Now, of course, we have moved into commodified medical systems. Technologically sophisticated systems, many of which, of course, are produced in the developed world and then imported here en masse. And many of these systems are way beyond the reach of the poor because you require monetary resources to have access to these systems. When, in fact, solution to this problem lies right here in the biogeography, right? Right here. But people somehow think it's inferior. It's strange, we have come full circle. Harvard Medical School is now running down to the Amazon frantically trying to collect herbs and stuff because before they are wiped out by the overexploitation of the forests that are occurring there. Because within the forest itself, there are all of these medicines that have not yet been discovered by man. And yet we are destroying this very part of the productive base in the Caribbean because of this productivist epistemology. That's two. And the final impact that I want to talk about because of this production that we have is the incorporation of the Caribbean into what I call the American psychic sphere of influence. which is leading to the destruction of psychic resources. What am I talking about here? This sounds kind of weird. I'm talking about, when I talk about psychic resources, I'm talking about a people's knowledge of self. A people's knowledge of self. And therefore, through this self-awareness, can people solve their own problems? What's happening now in the Caribbean because of CNN Live, because of the American mass media, because of the evangelical Protestant movement that is moving into the Caribbean all over, we are seeing not the gradual, but the rapid erosion of the Caribbean psyche. That's the way I view it. I am amazed, I'm astounded, because I live in the United States, that whenever I come back to the Caribbean, I see a new Caribbean. A Caribbean that is much more American-oriented. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with this if we accept the good parts of American civilization, right? But we seem to be accepting the bad parts. What's happening over time, of course, because of the erosion of the Caribbean psyche, it seems that Caribbean people are becoming increasingly unable to solve their own problems through their own agency. Nietzsche, almost 100 years ago, called this a will to power. What we are seeing in the Caribbean is an erosion of this will to power. Because we believe, for example, that foreign capital can solve all our own problems. We cannot solve our own problems through our own agency. The destruction of psychic resources. And it's all tied up with the type of economic production that's taking place here. So, the gist of the argument then that I'm attempting to make here is the following. Caribbean quote-unquote development, as it is currently conceptualized and practiced, is not the solution to Caribbean poverty, but one of its major causes. That's the argument I'm trying to make. Because of the way we have conceptualized the whole notion of development, it is not solving the problems of poverty in the Caribbean, it is actually one of the major causes. What we need, therefore, is to reconceptualize the entire notion of what development means. I believe that a viable alternative approach to Caribbean development that explicitly addresses the concerns of the poor lies in the activities of the hundreds of new social movements that have sprouted throughout the region over the past decade or so. This contention is not new. As the traditional structures of political power within the region, in particular the national governments, who have all bought in to this conceptualization of development that I'm talking about. Also the trade union movements. Many people, especially the poor in the Caribbean, are beginning to believe that they can solve their own problems through their own agency. And we are seeing this all over the Caribbean, where these new social movements are beginning to solve their own problems. But there's one fundamental problem here. And that's what I'll end on this note. A lot of interesting stuff is happening with these small social movements all over the Caribbean. The problem is that their praxis, their activities, is not being linked to an overarching theory. That is a fundamental problem. And those people who are working within Caribbean development right now, the development establishment, in other words, many of the economists, for example, at the University of the West Indies, who are doing really wonderful work, they are behind the corner, so to speak. Some interesting things are happening right now in critical social theory. And it's being reflected in anthropology and sociology and political science. And yet Caribbean development theory seems to be totally ignorant of what's going on out there. The work of Foucault, his links between language and power, for example, right? How it links up with epistemologies, how it is that people view their world, and how therefore they can empower themselves through discourse. The work of Habermas, Jürgen Habermas, the German social theorist, his links between system and life world, for example. How is it that the system of modernism is consuming the life worlds of the poor? How can the poor therefore escape from that system and exploit ecological niches to empower themselves? The work of Anthony Giddens and his work in structuration theory, which moves beyond Marxism, where he's looking at new links between agency and structure. Caribbean development theory right now, those people who are working in Caribbean development theory are still trapped within the prison of structure. And they don't recognize that human agency has a crucial role to play. And we need to look at that dialectic between agency and structure. And I can give you many other examples of this critical social theory that is sweeping the social sciences now. This has to be incorporated into Caribbean development theory if we are going to become conspicuous within the larger framework of third world development theory and not be marginalized. Caribbean development theory and theorists have been marginalized for too long. And we need to engage this type of debate right now. That's where we need to be going. I'll stop there. Okay, thanks.